start chapter 9. We're talking about meiosis. So what you're going to find with meiosis is that the process between mitosis and meiosis is almost identical. It's just in meiosis, you do mitosis twice. So a very broad brushstroke diagram of mitosis will look something like this, where in our bodies, we start off with a cell that has 46 chromosomes in it, right? And that is the diploid number. That's the full complement of chromosomes. And what we're going to end up with after mitosis is two daughter cells that are genetically identical to the mother cell. So they each have 46 chromosomes in them. Like that. And that's basically all mitosis is. It's just division of the nucleus and then ultimately division of the cell, right? Meiosis is a little bit different. With meiosis, we start off with a cell that has 46 chromosomes, and we're going to end up with 4 daughter cells that each have 23 chromosomes in them. So we're going to go through an initial nuclear division, and it's called meiosis 1. And we're going to end up with 2 daughter cells that each have 23 chromosomes in them. And then we're going to take those 2 cells and we're going to divide them again in meiosis 2. And we're going to get 2 more cells that each have 23 chromosomes in them. Now this division right here, meiosis 2, is identical to mitosis. It's exactly the same thing. There are a couple of differences here that we'll talk about, but not many. In fact, the names of the phases within meiosis are the same. So we have prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase in meiosis, just like we did in mitosis. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the purpose of meiosis. Meiosis, like mitosis, is just division of the nucleus. But it's division of the nucleus to produce gametes, right? What we want to produce from meiosis are things like sperm cells or egg cells, depending on if you're a male or a female. Now the beauty of this system is that each ends up as a haploid daughter cell, or with half the complement of chromosomes. And you'll remember that that's important because that allows us to constrain the number of chromosomes across generations. So if our gametes each had 46 chromosomes in them and there was fertilization that occurred, that zygote would have 92 chromosomes, right? We don't want that. So by this process of going, and we don't want that, right? Because we know that extra chromosomes are a bad thing. Trisomy 21 is a product of a single extra chromosome. Imagine what would happen if you had 46 extra.
Has there ever been a record of someone that has like that exponential record?
Mm-hmm. No, plants can do something similar, which if we talk about evolution towards the end of the semester, I'll mention that, but not in animals. Okay, so through meiosis, we produce gametes, right, that each have half the complement of chromosomes, which means that when fertilization occurs, we go from 2 cells that have 23 to a single zygote that has 46 chromosomes. And the gamete is just a reproductive cell, either an egg cell or a sperm cell. Fertilization, biologically, is just the fusion of gametes. It's a sperm cell swimming over to an egg cell, or it's a pollen cell fertilizing an egg cell. And then that fertilized egg cell is called a zygote. So, we've mentioned twice now one important characteristic associated with meiosis, and that's constraining the number of chromosomes. Secondly, though, and this is really a product of sexual reproduction, Most importantly, it introduces genetic variability into a population. And it's really, really difficult to underscore or to understate the value of genetic variation. Genetic variation is important because that's the currency of evolution. A population can potentially adapt to changing situations if there is genetic variability. In the absence of genetic variability, evolution is impossible, and there is no adaptation. And one of the major ways that we introduce genetic variability into a population is through sexual reproduction, which is all facilitated by meiotic divisions.
And what was the first part you said?
So constraining number of chromosomes,
Okay.
and then genetic variability. And here I refer to that as genetic recombination. Okay, so we know that there are cells that carry different numbers of chromosomes. If a cell carries the entire complement, at least in our genome, 46 chromosomes, that cell is referred to as diploid. If it's a gamete, it's haploid. There are some cells in some organisms that are triploid, some that are octoploid, some that are hexaploid. They can carry all sorts of weird chromosome numbers. In fact, strawberries are octoploid, and they carry 8 copies of each chromosome, which is pretty crazy. So in terms of reproduction, there are 2 possibilities, right? There is asexual reproduction, and that's reproduction via mitosis. A bit of you falls off, and then it grows into a new you. And then there's sexual reproduction, and that requires 2 individuals. There are costs and benefits associated with both. Asexual reproduction is still the primary mechanism for reproduction among things like bacteria and fungi. With those, sexual reproduction, or the exchange of genetic material, is really uncommon. But we know bacteria are super successful, right? Even though there isn't a ton of genetic variability introduced by reproduction, they're still incredibly successful. And then there's sexual reproduction, which requires 2 individuals, and they exchange genetic material. And so let's do like a really quick cost-benefit analysis of sexual and asexual reproduction. And list the benefits and the costs associated with each. So with asexual, the cost is obvious, right? The cost is no genetic variability. No genetic variation. And that's, from an evolutionary context, that's a bad thing. And it's not just like bacteria and fungi that do this. There are plants that are only asexual. There are animals that are only asexual. There are species of lizards, for example, where there are no known males. All of the individuals, the entire species, are female, which is pretty crazy. They all reproduce asexually. What's the benefit, though? So, what would you guys imagine the benefits are to asexual reproduction?
They don't need no man.
Okay, so all you need is yourself, just one individual. Which is actually true, right? I mean, think about socially how much we invest into finding a mate, right? I mean, you have to look nice and smell nice and all that. But if you can take care of business by yourself, then just, why not do that? Where's the fun in that, though, right? Okay, so what's another benefit of and you know, from a guy's perspective, this is also beneficial, right? Because think about like black widows and praying mantids that eat the male.
Females eat the male.
Sucks. So, what are some other benefits of asexual reproduction?
You don't get eaten.
You don't get eaten. It's safer, right? It's a lot safer. And it's not just, you know, you're worried about your wife eating you. It's like anything else, right? So you and I have the benefit of when we make children, of being like closed up inside a room or backseat of a car or whatever. You're in some enclosed space and somewhat protected. But think about like elk. I mean, they're out in the middle of nowhere, and when they're having sex, that's what they're thinking about, presumably. They're not thinking about like the wolves or the bears that are coming up behind them, right? And so it's a pretty dangerous sort of thing. Not to mention the kinds of like diseases that are transmitted through sexual interactions. Okay, so it's safer to be asexual. What else?
There's not the failure of like you having good genes and somebody else having bad genes.
Okay, so you know that you're successful where you are. And so why not just perpetuate your own genetic line? That's a really important one. Good genes remain good. That's a good one. Can't think of others.
It's controlled.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of control. And sister to that control idea is metabolically, it's inexpensive. Right? I mean, think about what guys do to go to produce sperm. I mean, guys produce a ton of sperm, a lot, right? We're investing a lot of energy into the production of gametes. And think about what you females have to go through. Every month you produce an egg. But in order to provide an environment that's suitable for the development of that egg, you go through the whole menstrual cycle. Metabolically, terribly expensive. And like physically uncomfortable as well, right? With asexual reproduction, you don't have to do any of that. All you do is you just shed a finger and that finger grows into a new you. Right? With sexual reproduction, it's basically the opposite, right? The real benefit of sexual reproduction, in addition to, I guess, recreation, is genetic variability. And I can't like understate the importance of genetic variability. This entire sexual system, which represents most of the organisms that we're familiar with, has evolved for this idea, genetic variability. And again, genetic variability is important because it's the currency of evolution. If a population is to remain relevant in time, it has to be able to adapt. And this is a primary way in which genetic variation is introduced. Yeah,
So
Sophia.
if they asexual, they like die off at one point. Because they can't they don't have genetic variation.
So if let's take a stand of quaking aspens, because aspens are all clones of each other. So if one tree is susceptible to some sort of virus that's introduced into that population, then all of the trees are going to be susceptible, and that entire population of trees could be wiped out. Yeah. Whereas in our population, right, if one of us gets a cold, then some of us might also be susceptible to that cold, but some of us are going to be genetically resistant to that cold, and we won't contract it.
So how do bacteria get stronger?
Good question.
Yeah.
The answer is mutation. Bacteria have such a short generation time that mutations accumulate incredibly rapidly. That's why you get antibiotic-resistant staph infections and E. coli infections. Yeah, good question. Okay, so the costs, and this is really just going to be an opposite list to this one, right? The cost is, metabolically, it's really expensive to go through sexual reproduction. So it's very expensive. You run the risk of a bad genetic combination. It's really dangerous. Yeah, I mean, and think about it, if you're a mountain lion, that's like a 2-for-1 deal. You know what I mean? If you sneak up on somebody and they're otherwise occupied, you get 2 of them. And then you need to find some other individual. And the process of finding another individual is dangerous by itself, so it requires 2 individuals. So even though there are all of these potential costs associated with sexual reproduction, this one benefit greatly outweighs the rest of them, which is a pretty crazy thing, right? Okay. So there are 2 different broad classes of tissues inside our body. There are the somatic tissues, which are all of the body tissues, like the tissues that make all of your organ systems almost, your heart, your lungs, your brain, your excretory system. Those are all somatic tissues. All of your muscles, your epidermal tissues, all somatic. And then there are the gametic tissues, and those are specifically the tissues that produce gametes. So in females, it's the ovaries. In males, it's the testes. Those are the gametic tissues. And these are the only tissues, the gametic tissues are the germline tissues that go through meiosis for nuclear division. Okay? You cool with that? All right. So on an exam, could you guys compare the relative benefits of asexual and sexual reproduction? Okay, so let's make sure that that's a really good exam question. You guys should know that. So all organisms go through what's called an alternation of generations, and that's where we alternate between a haploid and a diploid state. Now, for most animals, that haploid state is greatly reduced, right? There was a very short time where we lived kind of independently as mom's egg cell that hadn't been fertilized yet and dad's sperm cell that hadn't quite gotten there. The rest of our life, besides those gametic stages, it's all diploid. So for us, that diploid stage is dominant, but there are lots of other organisms that have a haploid stage that's dominant. Things like fungi and some protozoans, some protists, have a haploid stage in which they, like the vast majority of their lives, they just have what for us would be 23 chromosomes. And then they mitotically